Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to this, the first of our deep dive sessions. I hope those of you who were with us this morning had time for something to eat and a bit of fresh air and a bit of a break. But it's fantastic that we have almost 100 people already joining us for this first of the deep dives. So we're starting off by thinking about age-appropriate design and the role of age assurance and age verification. Now, this is actually something that's been highlighted a lot during the consultations with children and young people and teachers, but also if you were at the session just before lunch, it was very clearly and quite rightly a topic of discussion there as well. And so it's great that we now get a lot more time to focus on this in more depth. One of the four pillars of the original Better Internet for Kids strategy from 2012 focused on age-appropriate privacy settings, and it stated that although risks to privacy exist for all users, children are a particularly vulnerable group. And it made the point that very young children in particular do not know how to change their privacy settings and do not understand the potential consequences of their actions, such as becoming an easy target for grooming or exposing themselves to risks to their online reputation. Therefore, default privacy settings for children should be managed in ways that ensure they are as safe as possible. It went on to say, the big strategy this is, that industry should implement transparent default age-appropriate privacy settings with clear information and warnings to minors of the potential consequences of any changes that they make in their default privacy settings, and contextual information on the privacy level of every piece of information required or suggested to set up an online profile, and that they should implement technical means for electronic identification and authentication. Now, I think a huge amount has happened since this was written back in 2012, but the question, of course, is, are we where we think we need to be? We've got two excellent speakers to discuss these complex issues today. First of all, we're going to hear from Professor Simone van der Hoof from Leiden University in the Netherlands, where Simone is a professor of law and digital technologies. She's also Vice Chair of NICAM's Independent Complaints Committee for Age Classification of Audiovisual Media, and she's also currently involved in EU consent on the electronic identification trust services for children in Europe. The second speaker that we're going to hear from is Almudena Lara, and she's the Global Lead for Child Safety at Google. So she has a child protection background, having previously worked for the NSPCC in the UK, but she currently leads Google's work on protecting children from online harms and providing safe experiences for children across multiple Google products. So two amazing speakers, and I'm hoping that we will have lots of time for debate. The reason that we're using the Teams sort of platform here is so that you're actually able to contribute through the chat, but also when the time is right to be able to unmute and ask your question and have a dialogue with the speakers. So the plan is that Simone will speak, and then we'll have an opportunity for some questions for her from the floor. Then we'll pass to Almudena, and again some discussion afterwards, before we will make sure we have time at the end for some debate with the speakers and to you, the attendees who are here as well. So without any further ado, I will stop talking and I will hand over to Simone. We're really pleased you can join us, Simone, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Carl. I will first share my slides. It did work in a moment, so let's hope it still does. So
it does. That's great, Simone.
Okay, very good. Okay, Carl, thanks for introducing me so nicely, and I'm very honored to be here because this is a very relevant topic. It's very highly debated, as I heard it already was this morning, and I'd love to have that debate further this afternoon with you. I'm also very happy that to be here because, like Carl said, we're working on this project called EU Consent, which is a EU project. There will be a link on my last slide, so make sure to check that out because all the findings, or at least, you know, summaries of the findings that we already have based on the project that started in spring this year will be available on that website. So this is a project with a lot of partners. Leiden University is not doing it all by themselves. And I would, want to mention at least two of my partners because I'll be using some of their findings in this presentation as well. First of all, that is Aston University with his team, with a team led by Ablash Nair, and then Sonia Livingston and her team, and I believe she's also in the audience, if I'm not mistaken, who joined us in the project from the London School of Economics and Political Science. So let me see if this works. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about age verification and age-appropriate design. And let me first say something about the relationship between these two. So first, age verification is a tool that only needs to be used when an app, game, or website is not age-appropriate, and when there is a legal obligation to protect children from certain content and practices. So the purpose of age verification is to ensure that children's use of digital technologies is age appropriate and not harmful. And age verification is one of the instruments to contribute to the safe use of digital technologies by children. Then second, and that's the arrow going the other way, implementing age verification where necessary must be done in an age appropriate way. And more specifically, it must be done in a way that respects the rights of children and other users. So I will explain both sides of this story in more detail on the next slide. But before I do, one more remark. From the EC consultation, which I believe you have been discussing this morning, I also understood that young people want more age restrictions for children. I think it's important here. So that's an important remark from them that we need to take seriously, but I also want to point out here that we should not mix up age verification and age appropriate design. So the former, age verification, can contribute to age appropriate design, but will in itself not necessarily make the use of digital technology safer or age appropriate. So there may be more may be necessary to achieve that. And we also need to be careful, I think, to have to identify everywhere we go online. It might be a bit like, you know, having to show your ID all the time when you're going for a walk in the park, because it may be unsafe. So there's some issues we need to discuss then. When do we implement age verification, and how do we do it? So let me give some examples of where age verification can actually be a legal obligation. So first, let me say there is no general legal obligation for digital service providers to verify the age of their users. This is not to say that digital service providers do not have a duty of care to provide a secure service for their users, and in particular for children. However, the law does require digital service providers to implement age verification in certain circumstances, although the laws may differ from member state to member state. So let me give 3 examples here. So age verification is one instrument to protect children from harmful content under the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. So it's mentioned as one of the appropriate measures that can help protect children against viewing harmful content. And in the updated version of the AVMSD, obviously video sharing platforms have been brought into the scope of that directive as well. So this provision also applies to them. So in general, what we see is that age verification is required mostly in the EU for 18+ content. But what such content is can vary between member states. We see cultural differences there. A second example where we have a legal requirement is in the area of gambling services, although not all laws are specifically focused on online gambling. And what we also see here is that the minimum age for gambling may differ from country to country. So we see an age range from 16 to 21 when we look at all the countries in the EU. What we also see is that in addition to age verification, often other measures are required here as well. So age verification is not the only thing that gambling providers need to implement. So some laws also require you to identify or to register customers so you can support them when they show problematic behavior. And also there are rules which say that it's not allowed to target children with gambling advertisements, or even young adults for that matter. In this context also we see that some countries have specific regulations with respect to age verification, saying what methods need to be used, or having an obligation to report what methods are being used. Then the third example here is restricted goods. So there are age limits all across Europe, also for the sale of, for instance, tobacco or alcohol. And obviously these are products that you can also buy online. And here it's interesting because these products at some point need to be delivered to someone's house as well. So you don't necessarily have to age verify online. You could also do it when it's brought to the door. Evidence shows, however, that age verification measures are rarely implemented for the sale of restricted goods. So this all makes it clear that age verification can be one tool to protect children from potentially harmful content or practices, but there are others as well. Some countries, let me see. Yes. Some countries also use age classification to give parents and children the possibility to avoid viewing potentially harmful content. And this also takes into account the fact that not all children are the same. And what is unpleasant or even harmful for some to see may actually be appreciated or enjoyed by others. So it offers parents the opportunity to make their own decisions, preferably obviously in consultation with their children. In this respect, it's also interesting that evidence indeed shows that age ratings are seen as something advisory by parents rather than mandatory, which is also the way they are intended, obviously. Of course, age classification now also must be implemented in a meaningful way by video sharing platforms with the changes in the AVMSD. Another tool is what we call parental control systems, where parents are given the opportunity to set more strict limits, you could say, on what their children can see by, for example, creating an age-based profile for them. This also responds to the parents' desire for flexibility in deciding whether content or a service is appropriate for their children. And in that way, it's also in line with parents actually being the primary responsible for their children. We need to keep in mind here also that parental control tools can also create a false sense of security because they do not address any and all risks that children can run into when they're using digital technologies. And the same is actually true for age verification as well. Neither is or will be a silver bullet to protect children online. So we have to focus on what is the problem that we want to solve here. And we can also focus on, looking at whether some of the services can be designed in a more age-appropriate way by default, so you don't need age verification. So there's a lot of questions behind that we also need to look into. Another thing that I want to mention here is that running some risk may not necessarily be a bad thing either, especially if children have a supportive environment, which obviously is not true for all children, and if it increases children's resilience rather than harms them. So there are some nuances there as well. As I said, there is no general obligation for digital service providers to verify the age of their users. But this picture slightly changes when we turn our focus on the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. It's interesting because the GDPR doesn't have an explicit requirement for age verification, but there is an implicit requirement in the GDPR to verify the age of data subjects, because it provides, or it intends to provide, a high level of protection for children, for all children. So that is everyone under 18. So you could say it's you don't need to verify age when a child says that they're a child, that they're under 18. So you can take that as a given and provide them that high level of protection. But if a data subject says I'm over 18, you would need to verify the age to see whether it's not actually a child. So this high level of protection, we see it all across the GDPR. Sometimes it's explicit in some of the provisions, such as provisions on transparency, which, transparency of data processing, which needs to be understandable for children. And sometimes it's more implicit in the way some of the provisions are now being interpreted. So for instance, provisions on automated profiling, where we now see an interpretation emerge that says that this is something that should not be done, or should preferably only be done if it's in the best interest of the child. Another provision, obviously, that is important in this respect, and that's being discussed a lot in relation to children, is Article 8 on the age of digital consent, and on parental consent for children that have not reached the age of digital consent. But here it's also important to keep in mind that this provision has a limited application, because it only applies when consent is actually the lawful ground, and not when when data processing is based on other lawful grounds. But having said that, it is an important provision in the sense that if you do not check the age, and you're asking consent from children that are under the age of digital consent, you're actually processing that kind of data in an unlawful way. So it does have consequences legally if you don't do age verification in that respect. One other matter I would like to bring up here in relation to Article 8 is that what we found in the project EU Consent that we're working on right now is that it's in practice actually very difficult to verify whether a person is the parent or the guardian of a child, especially if you want to do it in a privacy-friendly way. And for that reason, we raised the question whether you could verification of parental consent, or verification of whether someone is the parent or the guardian, whether you could replace it by age verification. So in that case, you would verify whether a person is over 18, or whether the age difference between the person giving consent on behalf of the child is such that it could be the parent. I'm very honest about this. This is not an explanation that we've already seen in relation to the GDPR, but we wanted to bring it up anyway because of the practical problems that we saw. So all in all, the question here is, in order to apply the GDPR, do we always need to do age verification to make the distinction between children and adults, which has quite far-reaching consequences. So to stay in the context of the GDPR for one more moment, we also within the EU Consent Project, we looked at a lot of apps and games to see what they did in terms of age verification. And what we found was, and this might not be surprising to you, is that most of them use self-declaration. So you're giving your age or your date of birth as when signing up to the app or the game, and that is basically what they use for age verification. Obviously, it's very easy when you use such a method to actually manipulate age, and there's also an incentive for children, or at least for some children, to manipulate their age, because if they're below the minimum age of digital consent, because we only looked into apps and games that also use consent as a lawful ground, but if you're below that age, you will be excluded. So you have an incentive to provide a higher age and to make sure that you can sign up. Well, like I already said, well, this is problematic under the GDPR for two reasons. One I've already mentioned. If someone below the age of digital consent provides consent, consent is lawful because they don't have the legal capacity to do that. Another problem under the GDPR is that self-declaration is not an adequate verification method. You need a method with higher assurance in the case of high-risk data processing. And one of the factors to call something high-risk data processing is when you're processing data of vulnerable people, which obviously children are. Another factor is also using profiling, for instance, or any other data-driven techniques within your digital service, which is very often also done. So in the case of children, I would say that self-declaration is in any case not an appropriate way of verifying their age. And maybe one remark as well here. Self-declaration also puts sort of it seems like you're putting the responsibility on the child to provide the right age there. Age verification is not a responsibility for children or for parents for that matter. It's the responsibility of the digital service providers. It's the responsibility of the platforms, and they have to make sure that the methods that they implement are actually adequate enough in relation to the harm that children might run on a platform, but also in relation to the legal obligations that they have. We also, in this part of the research, looking into these apps and games, we also came across examples of platforms that actually use traditional ID documents to verify age of their users. And this brings up another important issue. Age verification should not lead to the collection or the processing of more data than is necessary. And when you look at your passport, you will see that it shows more personal data than just your date of birth. So traditional ID documents do show more data than necessary. On top of that, in age verification, you actually very often don't need to know the actual age of the person, just that they're above a certain age or within a certain age range. So it's understandable that some of these platforms fall back on traditional IDs because it's a common offline tool to check someone's identity or to check someone's age. But given the affordances of digital technologies, and particularly the potential for surveillance and commercial surveillance, I don't think they are actually suitable to be used by digital services. In relation to this, it's also important to develop verification methods that are specifically developed for the digital world, and that meet the requirements of privacy by design and privacy by default. And preferably, these methods are completely anonymous, so that no personal data is processed by them, and in that case, the GDPR wouldn't apply. And this can be done, for instance. There are methods that you can use for these purposes. For instance, by having age verification take place fully on the device of the user itself, so the age verification provider or the platform itself doesn't really see what the personal information is. They just get a check, yes or no. And this will also prevent the creation of central databases with a lot of identity information that is actually vulnerable to external attacks or vulnerable to data breaches. One of the other things to remark here as well, in terms of privacy by design, using sensitive personal data like biometrics, for instance, or using automated profiling for verification may actually not be in the best interest of children if there are methods that are, that are capable of using less data and being more secure. In terms of, on top of being privacy friendly, it's also important that verification methods are child friendly, or to use the term of this presentation, that they are age appropriate by design. Meaning that, for instance, children must actually know how they work, how they operate, what data they process, if at all. For instance, when we were signing up to these apps and games, as part of the research, we found that they automatically could see what country we were signing up from, because they automatically knew what the minimum age of digital consent was. But so they must have known they must have processed our location data. But you know, never in the whole process was it explained to us that they did. So it was more of a sort of an implicit thing that we had to find out for ourselves. And this is obviously something that they should have told us. Well, on top of that, children's rights, more specifically, obviously data protection is also a child right now, with the general comment 25 from the Children's Rights Committee. They specifically said so, but on top of that, also other children's rights make specific demands on the design of verification methods. So it's important that age verification methods are effective and proportionate. So they should do what they intend to do, what they need to do. Like I said, self-declaration in that terms it's not an effective method of age verification. It may be in some, you know, in some situations, if the stakes are not that high, but in other situations it may not be effective or proportionate. So they should also not be more intrusive than necessary in terms of excluding children, but also intrusive in terms of invading the privacy of the users. So it's strongly advised in relation to children, therefore, to do a child impact assessment to determine how verification methods actually impact children, how they impact their rights, depending on the way they've been designed and developed, to assess how to implement legal requirements in an adequate way, to address any concerns that children and parents may have, including their privacy concerns, but also other concerns, and to make sure that where there are concerns or issues, that age-appropriate safeguards are being implemented. Obviously, this is not a one-off exercise. This is something that needs to be done at regular intervals, because the use of verification methods in practice can require adjustments later on. Obviously, you need to involve children and parents, because they know what their experiences are, they know what their expectations are, their concerns, their needs. So you need to factor those in to make sure you develop something that is actually working for them. Working for them also means that these methods should take into account that not every child is the same. They have different ages, different stages of development, but there may also be differences in other ways. And the design and development of these verification methods must take this into account to make sure that they can be used by all children, but also by all parents. I mean, not all parents may not be tech savvy enough to use these kinds of technologies or to understand how they use, which is important as well. So they should be inclusive, and children should not be excluded, not just because of their age, but also because of other situations, like their cognitive or physical situation. So this should also be part of a child impact assessment to make sure you really get it right. And then obviously, if you developed an age verification method, it's important that children are able to report problems, or parents for them are able to report problems with using them or with the way they work, or to get support if they have trouble using the verification methods in a way. And all this information should be provided in a way that is age appropriate as well. And again, here, the same may be true for a lot of parents. They also may need to have, information or support that is specifically designed for them as well. So to wrap up, age-appropriate design does not necessarily mean we always need age verification. Although it's, I agree, it's an important tool that we can implement. But when age verification is implemented, is required and implemented, sometimes it's also legally required, obviously. It must be done in a way that is age appropriate and that takes into account the rights that children have and their particular situation. So thanks for listening to me. And I'm looking forward to any questions or remarks that you may have. And also please see the link to the EU consent website, which I would like to point out again, because I've only presented some of our findings here, and you may find a lot more information there if you're interested in the topic. So thank you very much. I'll hand back to you, Carl.
Simone, thank you so much. I think you've made a very complex area much easier to understand. I think you've given us a lot of really concrete examples there. I want to try and address a few questions just before we do pass to Almudena. And I can see that Neil Fairbrother's asking a question if perhaps we can give him permission to unmute. But while we do that, June from the Commission has asked, I think, a question that everyone will be very interested in. She said, you know, what do the speakers think about age recognition tools that are actually based on facial images? We hear a lot about this from platforms like Yoti and so on. And could you say something about that?
You addressed the question to me, I guess.
Please, Simone. Yeah, apologies. Yes, please.
Yeah. No, I wasn't sure. Maybe you were asking the audience. Yeah, well, actually, this is one of the solutions that obviously also came up during the research that we did, and that we've actually extensively discussed also. It doesn't really, if we go back to my presentation just now, it doesn't really line up with what I said about these methods being privacy preserving, because using pictures and they also, well, it's not entirely clear whether they're using biometrics, but that's the, you know, the impression that we got. And biometrics are sensitive personal data, but even pictures in and of themselves can be quite sensitive. So to be honest, I would be very careful using methods like that. Certainly if there are other methods that are more privacy preserving, and therefore also maybe more age appropriate and child friendly. So, so I would be rather careful using those kinds of methods. And we saw, because one of the apps that we looked into was, what was it called? Yubo, and they actually used Yoti, but it was also only usable by some children because you had to have reached the age of minimum age of digital consent, because they also said during the process it's biometrics, so we need to have your explicit consent, which is true under the GDPR. So you're already excluding then a number of children or a large number of children that cannot use it. They had a workaround for that because you could also use other age verification methods, but you could still circumvent them. So, so it was still not entirely adequate in the way that that it was actually age verification. So they made an attempt, but you could easily circumvent it as self-declaration, basically. At least that's what we found at the time when we looked into the app in spring.
Thanks, Simone. I think that's always the challenge, isn't it? Young people seem to be pretty adept. We're always being told it's managing to circumvent many types of, you know, safety guards that are put in place. I don't know whether, Neil, we've tried to give you permission to unmute. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. I believe I'm unmuted. But thank you so much. My question is, can we really have age verification just for children? And the reason I ask that, it seems to me that if we do, then we'll end up with the with the fox in the hen coop problem, whereby predators will bluff their way through the system and become de facto children. when in fact they're not. And so the system has then authorized these people to be children, yet they are not children. So do we not have to have age verification? If you're going to do it at all, do we have to have age verification for everyone, adults and children, so that adults are filtered out and children are filtered in?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Talking about circumvention, I didn't really circumvent it in the presentation, but I also didn't answer it actually. And so actually, I think what you're saying now, my answer would be yes, we would need that if we want to do it, we want to get it right. And this raises a lot of discussion. So already in relation to the GDPR, you see that if you want to make the distinction between children and adults, you will need to know who your users are. And then I said, okay, but if they say they are a child, you don't necessarily have to check it, but you can take it as a given. But if they're saying they're an adult, you need to check it, because if they're still a child, if they are a child, they will not get the high protection that you need to give them. So I said that, which is true under the GDPR, but more generally, it's not true, because you're right. You could easily, as an adult, you could say you're a child. So you would also need to check at the entrance of an app or a game whether the person that is actually signing up is indeed a child, as if they say they are. And that, the conclusion there then is that you would need to age check everyone at some point, if you're really serious about making that distinction when signing up to an app or game, or when using an app or game. And I think that is an important discussion to have, because is this really something that we want? Because a lot of adults will say, well, then please exclude all those children, because I don't want to do that. Because it also means something about, not being anonymous anymore on the internet. I don't agree there, by the way, because you can still do it in an anonymous way, but it's still, more intrusive than if you could just sign up without any age check. But yeah, that would be the consequence. So that is something that we I think need to discuss here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks for the response, Simone. I want to just bring up one point that's in the chat from George, who's actually one of the youth panelists from Malta. He says something that I also think could be possible would be an electronic ID document, similar to some Apple services where you can kind of pick what to share. So an app would ask you for permission to get access to your age only, rather than all of the huge amounts of other personal information that's there. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Simone.
Yeah, I think that would be a great solution, actually, because it would be on your device, and you wouldn't have to share anything. So it would sort of be an automatic process where you can sign up to some services and maybe not. Well, I don't want to exclude anyone. But you can sign up in an age-appropriate way, both the signing up, but also then the use of the service can be, by design, be in an age-appropriate way for, depending on what kind of user you are. The problem maybe with that kind of, but I'm not a technologist, maybe George could, would have more of a background there. You would probably need Apple to implement, or need, other companies whose devices you're using to implement that kind of a solution. But I think it would already be a good way forward, in the sense that it's in your hand as the user to provide that information. Well, you're not really providing that information. You're just providing a yes or no. It's just a verification check, basically. Yeah, so I think it's a very good remark. Thanks, George. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I think something that's come up, already this morning and last night is about choice. And I think, very often it feels that, we're presented with something and everything seems to be switched on. And perhaps if it was the other way around and we could choose what was switched on, it would give us a bit more agency, perhaps. I think we've got another one of our youth panelists, actually, Liana. I think we've given you permission to unmute, Liana. I don't know whether you'd like to ask your question, but please go ahead if you're able to.
Hopefully you guys can hear me.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. I have quite a long question, so bear with me. So if the corporation, the social media corporation, does decide to use face recognition or ID or any personal way to verify age, what will happen to all the information that they will hold, and how do we know if this information will not be abused?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, obviously they can provide us with information as to how they, how they collect it, how they store it. The question is whether they will do that and whether they will do it in sufficient detail for us to make, to assess whether it's done in a secure way. And then the further thing is that, are we even capable of understanding, or are most people, capable of understanding then whether it's being stored in a secure way? So in that respect, I think it's also very much a matter of trusting that service provider to do it in a way that is secure and safe. But then again, having a central database with all that information is, by nature, more vulnerable than not having that database and do it in a decentralized way. And I just saw in the chat that Ian Corby, who is also part of the EU Consent Project, mentions the wallet 2.0 that's being developed in EIDAS, for instance. So there are methods being developed that are much more secure. So then my question is, why not choose those methods if they're more secure by default? So that would be my answer there. I think it's difficult to explain. So it's a matter of trust, and there are more secure methods, and maybe also good to say here that I think it was the EDPB, the European Data Protection Board, that said in relation to privacy by design, the adequate method to use is the one that is state of the art in providing privacy by default. So you could say if there are methods that are better capable of providing those privacy by default options, as a service provider, you're actually legally required under Article 25, which is about privacy by design, to use those methods because you need to use state-of-the-art methods there. So, I would not be. I don't think I'm in favor of anything that is that is stored centralized or that uses sensitive personal data.
Thank you so much.
And maybe
Simone.
I can.
Sorry, please. Yeah.
Yeah, can I respond? Because someone says I can't find it anymore. Yeah, why not make services age appropriate by default? I think that is a very good response as well. Like I said, there is not always a legal obligation for platforms to use age verification. But when we look at the Children's Rights Framework, there is a duty of care for service providers to make sure that if children are using their platforms, that they can be safe there. And there might be other solutions to actually make sure that children are safe there. I mean, we're not going to make them, we're never going to make them 100% safe. Nothing in the world can be 100% safe. But obviously there are practices on platforms where I think these companies can take more responsibility in terms of making it more age appropriate. Certainly those platforms that are, hugely popular among children.
Yeah, absolutely, Simone. And I think that point was made last night, actually, by some of the young people who said, we appreciate that just like the offline world, nothing online will ever be completely safe. I think they understand that. And there's been a comment there from Ian Corby in the chat, sort of saying one example of privacy by default is storing age data in a way that can only be unlocked by the user themselves, in what is known as an enclave, an enclave. In other cases, there's no need to retain anything other than a coded username and the age answers. So there are clearly options to this. And thanks so much for sharing that. Ian, Barbara from the Austrian Safer Internet Centre sort of makes a sort of thinking out of the box point as well. And she says, actually, what would be even better would be to have attractive content for young people so they don't want to go into those spaces where the unsuitable content actually is. So look, I think what we'll do now, Simone, thank you so much for responding to all the different questions there. Please stay with us because we'll hopefully come back at the end. But I would like to pass, and I think it's very appropriate now to hear from industry. There's lots of questions being asked there of industry. And so I'd like to give the floor to Almudena. You're really welcome and thanks for making the time to join us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Do you hear me well? Just to check.
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, all good. Excellent. And I am actually delighted to be here and to be having this conversation. And I cannot emphasize more how important it is that we are talking about this issue, as Simone said before. I think that it's an area that is changing rapidly and is attracting a lot of attention at the moment, and for the right reasons. So we do really need to collectively work together, work with regulators, with parents, with children, with civil society, with tech companies to explore this space. And I think it has been clear from the conversation with Simone and the questions that have been asked that this is an area where there are trade-offs that we all need to explore. And we all, as a society, I think we need to be comfortable with some of the trade-offs here. I think in the morning presentations, there was a lot of emphasis on the participation of children and the right to participate and the protection of children. And sometimes these two things are put as if they are in conflict. I think we need to work to make them both possible at the same way and to find a way in which we can develop age-appropriate experiences for children that make them safer and also allow them to participate and empower them to make the best of the digital world. So hopefully we'll get there, but I think it is the beginning of what I hope will be a very fruitful conversation. So I think it was mentioned before as well about the need to, when we talk about age assurances methods and age verification, I think one of the important things that we need to also focus on is that we need to design experiences that are great for children. I think one of the binds in which we can find ourselves is that we end up in a situation where we have brilliant methods of age verification and actually tell us if someone is an adult or a child and allow us to gate children out of adult experiences. But that won't be great for children unless we're also able to give them age-appropriate experiences that are great and that are where they want to be. And I think people have mentioned the fact that children bypass some of these protections. I think unless we are able to give children great experiences that they want to enjoy and where they want to be, will actually are likely to make them less safe rather than more, because we'll be encouraging them inadvertently to bypass those systems. So I'm showing here a few of the examples of some of the work that Google has done to develop great experiences for families and kids. And I think over the years, and this is a growing space, we heard as well from TikTok this morning and from Lego. I think all companies are focusing on developing really better and safer experiences for children. So there was also quite a lot of conversation this morning about the need to invest in digital literacy. So Be Internet Awesome, which is called differently in different countries in Europe. It's the program that Google has in place to support children with digital literacy, but also importantly also work with the community of teachers and parents to improve the overall understanding of these services. At the other end of the slide, YouTube Kids, obviously a very purposefully built experience for young children in mind, but also very recently, at the beginning of this year, we launched YouTube supervised experiences, which actually was launched in recognition that there was a gap between the time where children found YouTube Kids too young for them and the time where they reach the age of consent and they can actually access YouTube main. So this is an experience that allows children to benefit from access to the main YouTube experience, but in a more controlled way. So parents can control there are 3 different buckets of content that parents can choose from in terms of the access that the children get, but also the experience has safer features. So chat functions are off, content creation functions are also off to create a safer experience for children. And the bit and the platform and infrastructure in which some of these younger experiences are built on is Family Link. So this is for Google, this is the parental tool that allow families to develop healthy digital habits together. And what this platform plays an important role in the story of age-appropriate experiences, because it was also mentioned this morning the important role that parents and carers have and the different needs of different families and the evolving capabilities and capacity of children. So the tool is actually designed for parents to monitor and to develop the right digital habits for their family. And also, like if a child under the age of digital consent tries to open an account with Google, I think they can't, because you can only open a Google account, can only be created for children that are over the age of consent. So we direct children under the age of consent to Family Link for the family to create this account for them. There are additional experiences for children with additional protections, and I'm not for the benefit of time, I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but even for children over the age of consent but under the age of 18, we recognize that they need to have extra protections in place. For example, we have put safe search on by default, location histories disabled, personalized ads disabled, etc. So just to give a sense that within great experiences for children, we also need to think about how we create a more protected experience for the child. So now to the crux of the conversation. So when I say that these experiences are designed for children and are for children, I think the big part of the debate, and Simone was talking very successfully about this, is how do we know if we have a child in our services? And the answer is that it's not easy. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to knowing exactly if a child is present in your service, and it's something that many regulators, many companies are currently actively thinking about. How do we individually as companies, but also collectively, find the right method? So zooming in, I'm going to talk a bit about what's the current method that Google implements. And then we can build from this into thinking about what else needs to be, what does this tell us, and what else do we need to have in place. So for Google, the first step is an age screen for sign-in users. So when you open an account, you're asked to introduce your date of birth, and this date of birth is the gate that we have or the screen that we have for introducing your age is designed in a neutral way. And by that I mean that we don't nudge users to tell us that they are above a certain age. So we just simply ask for what's your date of birth. And we also don't allow users to back button. So once they have introduced a date, we don't allow them to go back and correct that date. So if a user enters the age below the age of consent, as I mentioned before, we ask them to get help from a parent or a carer, and we direct them to the Family Link app so that they can actually create a supervised account. If a user enters an age between the age of consent and 18, we will put them into the more protective experiences that I have explained before. So safe search on by default, more privacy settings by default, etc. But if a user tells us that they are above the age of 18, or if they are sign-out users, we have started in Europe to roll out machine learning models to assess the likelihood that the user is really above the age of 18 or below. So if based on our model, we believe that the user is likely to be under 18, we will move them to the safer minor mode that we have created. Again, safe search on by default, more privacy settings, etc. And the way this model works is that we use signals such as the type of sites that the user is searching for, or the category of videos that the user has been watching on YouTube, or the longevity of the account. So for example, if someone has an account for more than 18 years, we immediately can infer that the user is over the age of 18. But back to the other signals that we might use. So for example, and this is an example that is quite blunt, the whole system is a bit more subtle than this, but if you have been looking for mortgages or for tax advice, we might infer from those searches that you are above the age of 18. There is obviously like a question here emerging about what happens with dual purpose use of devices and accounts as well, and how do we tell the difference. But the point that I want to make here and to acknowledge is that these machine learning methods and these algorithms and classifiers are not perfect. So we are aware that we might actually end up putting adults into the minor mode category. And we are, one of the basis of the method as well is that we tell users when they have been put in a minor mode, and we give them the option of getting into the adult mode, or when they are trying to access mature content, for example, they might also be given the opportunity to provide additional evidence that they are adults if they have been misclassified as under 18. And we do that by means of a government-issued ID, or by allowing an authorization on the user's credit card. So this gives you a sense of the variety of methods that we are implementing to try to understand the age of the users in a way that actually tries to balance the competing needs, minimizing the friction in the system, and also minimizing the amount of data that we collect on the users. But as I said, this is new territory and a territory that we are conscious that we need to continue to explore and evolve. So as we explore and further evolve this method, and before we open up the floor for discussion, I want to share some of my reflections, which hopefully dovetail with what Simone was saying as well, about what makes for a good age assurance method. So one of the key principles would be that the system needs to be adhered to the principle of proportionality. They need to be proportionate to the risk that children are likely to experience. So, for example, asking to provide a government ID in order to check the times of the cinema is clearly disproportionate, but it might be appropriate if what we are talking about is viewing pornographic content or purchasing alcohol. And it's also might not be proportionate if someone wants to access content as a sign-out user. So if they want to check the location of a restaurant and don't want to sign in, I think that there is a scope and space. There needs to be scope and space in the system for valid signed-out experiences that need to be protected. So the principle of data minimization and purpose limitation, we need to make sure that the system is privacy preserving and that we should collect and use the minimum amount of data necessary for providing our services and ensuring that the service provided is age appropriate. The point of user-friendly and inclusivity, I think it is very important. And we know that users abandon a service or seek to circumvent the control if the process is too onerous or if it is being seen as too intrusive and too invasive of their privacy. So we need to design a system that is user-friendly and that is user-friendly for all users. So I think that Simone also mentioned this, but there is a risk that in developing these systems, we disfavor the most vulnerable users, and we increase rather than decrease the digital gap. So, for example, a system that requires government ID identification might actually put at or might be less attractive for children in the LGBTQ community who might be concerned about providing their identity, and that might result in them not having access to services. Or it might be that in some countries and in some circumstances, some people might not have access to either government IDs or credit cards. So we need to make sure that the system, there was a question before about the use of facial recognition and biometrics. I think my response to that would be that I think we need to be open to the use of a combination of methods that actually might help us to create a system that is fully inclusive and friendly. But that brings me to my fourth point. The system needs to be trusted by users. So users, like if we move to a system where we need to verify the age of the users or to know more about whether we have children in our services, users will have to entrust us with their data. And that is a big responsibility. So we need to make sure that we are more transparent about how the data is being collected and or shared, how it is being used, how it is being stored, what data is being kept, etc. So a bit building on the question that Eliana asked before, how can we as companies also build that trust? But also I think that this is an important message as well to the Commission and to regulators and civil society. How can you all as well ensure that users in general and children in particular understand why it is that we are being required to ask for this information, because those messages will naturally not come, not be as trusted if they come from us. And the final point that I want to make is collaboration. So once we have made strides in the world of age assurances, I think that the final solution will require a cross-industry collaboration. And I can hear what Simone is saying, and I agree with her that a very centralized solution has problems, but we also need to balance here the need to provide a solution that is not excessively cumbersome for users to continually engage with the system when they engage with multiple providers. So I think part of the answer needs to lie in industry collaboration. So hopefully this help us to move forward, and I'm really optimistic that we can get to a place where we not only offer children safer experiences, but we actually allow them to fulfill their aspirations and make the best of what technology has to offer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Almudena. A lot of information there, really useful, and I really appreciate that you've tried to address all of the things that we asked you to, talk about, which I know was quite a tall order. There've been a couple of questions that have come up during your presentation there. One is really very, very specific, and you may or may not be able to answer this, but Craig from Super Awesome spotted in the slide that you shared and said, why do you ask for gender as well as age information? When you ask people to give their date of birth, there was also a box that said gender, and he's asking why that's there.
Instead of trying to make up an answer, I'll say I'll follow that up, because it's a good question, and I don't want to mislead you with an answer. So yeah, happy to follow that up.
No, thank you, and that's a good answer. Much rather you'd say that than tell us something that wasn't accurate. There was another question from one of our youth panelists, actually, Angelo from Malta, and he said, it's really good to hear about things that are happening by default and so on, but also he said, if you take something like Family Link, would Family Link provide alerts if a member, part of that sort of group, was kidnapped or lost, for example? Would there actually be an alert created?
So I don't know if kidnapped or lost, but like one of the functions that a Family Link has is that you can enable and share your location with the members of that Family Link group. So if you are actually in a place that is compromising your safety or your security and you have your shared location, those in the group can actually see where you are. I think that one of the important things that we debated a lot internally is whether it was right for parents to always monitor where their children are. And this is one of those situations of tension between safety and providing parents with a sense of safety and control versus the right of a child to also have some freedom and some personal space. And the way we actually try to reconcile that is by making sure that children always get an alert when their location is being followed and monitored. So they can be tracked by the parent, but they know that they are being tracked. And some people find that function, both parents and children, incredibly helpful. Some others find it very intrusive, I know, but it does have it is a function that is there for parents and children to use.
Yeah, and I think that the point you make about transparency, so they are made aware if this happens, I think is really important. We've got another one here actually from Liana, another one of the youth panelists, and it's great that, as always, they're being massively active here. She says Google talk a lot about age restriction, but what about the privacy of the user? You know, so what measures would you take to prevent that information from being stolen? And I think it links to sort of if you're using ID or credit cards or things like that as a method of verification.
Yeah, I mean, like the first thing to say is that we've done recently quite a big effort in improving our privacy notices for all users, but in particular for young users, and hopefully everybody can actually access them, and I'm happy to share them more widely. But we've done quite a lot of work with children themselves to develop a language that is easily accessible, and we have done that by age categories and groups. But when it comes to storing data of users, I think it's a point very well made, Leanne. I think we need to be absolutely clear and transparent about what is the type of data that we use and how do we store it and how we dispose of it when not needed. So the principles of data minimization and the use of the data for the specific purpose, the purpose limitation is essential for us. And not least because it links to the other bit that Leanne also brought forward, which is the trust. Those two things really go hand in hand.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we've got a couple of minutes left, and I wonder whether Simone can join us back on screen as well, so that we can all three be here. That there's been a question that June actually posed, which I think is really important. She sort of says, has the practical start of the UK age-appropriate design code brought about any significant changes in terms of access or business behaviour? And I'm sure most people are aware that the age-appropriate design code came into force in the UK back in September, and it seemed to be accompanied by quite a number of announcements from tech companies about changes to privacy, not just in the UK, which is great, you know, but you know, sort of worldwide. So I don't know whether you perhaps would both like to make a comment on that. Perhaps Almudena first.
I think this has, as I say, is the beginning of a journey, and certainly we are looking at all the upcoming regulations and debates in this space, and it's very clear that we need to move forward and offer better privacy and protection for children, and that actually age assurances will be a part of the solution, not all the solution, but it will be a key element that will help us to move in the right direction.
Thanks, Almudena. Simone, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, well, it came into effect only a month ago, so it wasn't long yet, although we've all seen it coming, so you could anticipate. I haven't researched to what extent services have actually changed. Some of them made announcements that they were making adjustments, and obviously that is great. Having said that, if you look at the age-appropriate design code, you will see that it's a big task to actually make sure that you comply with it. So my gut feeling would say I can't imagine that companies are actually already living up to the expectations that are being raised by the age-appropriate design code. Because I also acknowledge that it's not easy to implement it, and that's also, and it's not only about age verification, but if we only look at the topic of age verification, we see that there is already a lot of conversation that we have about it. So what do we want? What don't we want? So we need to have these discussions, and also we need to have these discussions much more broadly in relation to other topics that are in the age-appropriate design code. But having said that, I think it's a really very, very important development, and I do sincerely hope that companies are going to take it seriously. Because it is very important for children to get it right, and to be honest, also for other people. I would like to have some of those protections that are in the age-appropriate design code, even though I'm not a child anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for that. We need to draw to a close. I'm going to finish, if I may, by asking you both to give a very short answer to this question. Our colleague from the European Commission, June Kingston, she was speaking at an event recently, and I was listening. And June made the point, and I hope she doesn't mind me sharing this, but she said, you know, we shouldn't be still talking about age verification in 10 years' time. And I just wonder, you know, how you would both respond to that. Do you think we will still be talking about age verification in 10 years' time? I appreciate it's difficult to look into the future, but clearly we would hope not to be talking about it. But what do you actually think? Simone, do you want to have a go at that one first?
Well, maybe we should still be talking about it, but in a different way. In you know, is it actually working well? I mean, the technology is also constantly developing, so it is an ongoing conversation. And maybe I can add one thing here as well, because Almudena was talking machine learning, and we've heard about the options, you know, that Yoti is giving with the face estimation. So I do understand these developments as well, because everyone is sort of searching for the right solution to get it right. I think one of the warnings I want to give here is that sometimes with new solutions, new technologies, or new implementations of technologies, you also raise new problems. And that is one of the concerns I have, because some of these new solutions might not be transparent, might not be understandable to people. So how are you going to explain them what you're actually doing? They may raise other issues, like Almudena also says, they're not always working well. Well, that can maybe be improved. But it raises new questions, new issues, and sometimes also new problems. And we should be aware of that as well. So I understand that innovations are developing, but it is important that we have these conversations also about these new technologies to see whether those are the ones that we want, even if they would work. So I fully subscribe also to the principles that were brought up by Almudena on her slide, and that I think coincide with mine very nicely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely, and really helpful to see those 5 things there. And Almudena, the final word to you.
Yeah, well, you know, 10 years is a long time at the speed that technology is evolving. So I do hope that maybe we are not talking about age assurances, but there are certainly, I think, how we all work together to get it better for children is likely to still be part of the conversation as technology evolves, as new things come to the table, etc. So I'm like, selfishly, I don't think we are gonna get run out of things to do. We are gonna be busy, but hopefully always nudging towards getting it better for children.
Great. Thank you both so much. And I'm sure that colleagues on the call, over 160 colleagues, will want to join me in thanking you both for your wisdom, your insights, your input. And if I can just thank everybody who's joined the call today, and to those people who got involved in the chat as well. The next one is going to start in sort of 10 minutes time. Hopefully that still allows people to get a cup of coffee, some refreshments and so on. Deep Dive 2 focuses on new and emerging technology, very pertinent to what we've just been talking about, and it will be with Dr. Victoria Baines, who many of you know is a real expert in this field and will really challenge us to think about what we can expect in the coming years. But thanks so much to Simone and Almudena, and we'll see you all in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.